Like nothing else, they represent the Middle Ages. Castles take us back to dramatic times. They're shrouded in myths and legends.
Castles are places where people lived and worked and died.
They were economic centers, fortified homes, and sites of countless battles. They become part of the European heritage.
History was made in any castle.
Yet, what was life like behind their walls? Around the year 1000 AD, there still prevailed the law of might is right. As for personal security or that of one's family, it was every man for himself. So those with the necessary means went about setting up a safe place. A refuge, impenetrable to enemies. This is what castles were meant to be, and they proved highly successful throughout the Middle Ages.
They are the most obviously recognizable memento of the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages is where our society comes from. They remind you of the medieval past, and that's a connection with our own history.
No other type of building has left a more obvious imprint on our landscape. In all of Europe, we come across these silent witnesses of the Middle Ages. Sometimes they were within sight of each other. And no two castles were further apart than a day's march. Yet only a fraction of the medieval fortresses still stands. Often, only their name has survived. Throughout Europe, thousands of street and place names bear witness to this immense number. Cities like Regensburg, Newcastle, Belgrade, or Castel Gandolfo have kept the term of their origin in their names. Boistrat, Prajanska na Mesti, or Plaza del Castillo are all reminders of places where medieval castles once stood. The most popular type of castle was that built on a high cliff. The position itself provided protection from potential attackers, as well as a splendid view of the surrounding countryside and any approaching enemy. While in flat country, they needed additional measures of fortification. A moat, for instance, to keep the attackers at bay. It was even more practical if you could use a lake or a river as a natural moat. Castle Predjama in Slovenia is a good example of sophisticated utilization of natural conditions. Here they've merely erected walls in front of a cave. It could be as simple as that. During the early Middle Ages, most castles were still built of wood. A fortress of stone was beyond the means of the average nobleman. The so-called Colmar Annals state, the lesser nobles out in the country had small towers, which they could barely defend against their fellow knights. Proper castles or fortified places were an exception. But even simple wooden towers offered some protection, and the dense forests of Europe back then provided wood in abundance. It was a convenient building material, and thus the wooden castle became the standard model of early medieval fortifications. A wooden tower on a hill may be basic, but it does serve its purpose as a defensive stronghold, and already shows most of the features of its stone-built successors. The keep stands upon an artificially erected mound, the so-called motte. The term, as well as the architectural design, is of French origin. Most keeps were surrounded by a palisade fence, and if possible by a moat. So there are the same defensive elements as in later castles. Every motte had its outward bailey. It too was fortified by palisades in a trench. The bailey would provide space for outbuildings, stables and huts for the serfs of the lord of the castle. In France and in Great Britain, the wooden motte has survived in the shape of their stone-built siblings, the donjon castles. One of the oldest examples is Gisors in Normandy. Their telltale feature is the central keep, which housed the lord of the castle and his family. Gisors was built in the 11th century, and back then was a substantial complex. It guarded the frontier against the English neighbours. In England too, there's also a motte from Norman times. Windsor Castle was originally built by William the Conqueror as part of a ring of fortifications around London.
Windsor is one of the greatest castles in any way you care to name in Europe, really. Its origins, like most of our great castles with William the Conqueror, and the main legacy from his time is not a building, but the layout, which is very distinctive and known in England only at a couple of other sites, including Arundel. And that is to say that in the middle there is a great big motte, a big mound, and then there are two bailies, one each side. So it forms a kind of figure of 8 with the motte in the middle, which means that it's enormous, and it is one of the biggest castles in Europe to this day.
During the 12th century, the original wooden keep was replaced by a stone building. With time, the royal fortress was considerably enlarged, and ever more buildings were added, which now took up the apartments once in the donjon. Other than Royal Windsor, most of the medieval castles were rather humble affairs. Life here was anything but luxurious. Usually, the castle's inhabitants lived under the same roof as their cattle and pigs. Sometimes even directly above them, so as to have a natural source of heating. Even as a knight you are surrounded by bleating sheep, cattle, and people wearing clogs. There's nothing but grind and constant bustle. A nobleman summed up life in his castle. And as for personnel, in most castles there were only 2 guardsmen, a handmaid, and a churl. That would have been about it. But then, during the 12th and the 13th centuries, with the ascendancy of the Staufen dynasty, castle building started in earnest. During their reign as emperors of the Holy German Empire, no fewer than 15,000 castles were constructed. To the Staufers, castles were a means of securing power. Like here in the Palatinate, they blanketed Europe with a virtual net of castles.
The most famous German castles that certainly spring to an English mind are the ones built in the 12th century and the 13th century under the Hohenstaufen dynasty, where generally you have a curtain wall running around, fairly simple, and crucially, the obsession with very tall, non-residential but defensive towers, the Burgfriede. So that German tradition of the Burgfriede, the great block in the middle, which is the palace, and this wall around the outside is something you don't find in England and belongs to a different tradition, although the ultimate purpose of being a castle is the same.
According to a medieval saying, the father of Emperor Barbarossa always had a castle at hand when traveling the country, thereby extending his grip on the land. Many nobles followed the example of the Imperial dynasty and erected castles of their own. Under the Staufers, castles became the prominent feature of Central Europe. The dynasty's empire extended from the North Sea down to southern Italy. Cleverly arranged marriages helped them to enlarge it even further, always securing their new possessions by yet more castles. The virtual mushrooming of castles was also fostered by a favourable climate, which brought about rich harvests. As a consequence, Europe's population swelled, and more people meant more subjects for the nobles, making the lords wealthier than ever before, since medieval society was built on a strict hierarchy. The lowest stratum was made up of the peasants, by far the largest part of the population. Most of them were directly dependent on the nobles, who themselves had been given land as fees by their rulers, which they then had to administer. On top of the pyramid was the king, the first among the nobles who owed him allegiance. Besides rallying to the king's standard in case of war, the nobles were also obliged to build castles. Yet, before they could start a given project, they had to call on their overlord for approval. In other words, a building license from the local authority, quite like today.
That approval was needed from high up is amply documented. There is legislation in the so-called Sachsenspiegel which explicitly states what constitutes a fortified building. In other words, is it a castle, and does it therefore need to be approved beforehand? This includes buildings which are surrounded by a trench deeper than a man's height, or with walls so high they cannot be reached by a rider on his horse, or when walls have been crowned with battlements, or a building which has a gate above ground level.
Castle Eltz, above the Moselle River, is a classic example of the castle boom during the Staufer era. In the beginning, there was only a single tower. It was home to the brothers Wilhelm, Elias, Theodoric, and their families. When their father died in 1268, he left 3 sons, but just 1 castle. This kind of medieval flat-sharing community is also called a Gan heritage. The cramped conditions were a recipe for friction. Yet, even if there was conflict, the families stuck together for centuries. 33 generations later, Castle Eltz is still family-owned. Today's lord of the castle is Karl Count Eltz.
The Gan heritage obviously came about because there were too many male heirs. It was a way of coming to terms with what little you had, a single castle in this case, accompanied by a rather limited amount of land, which had to be shared by the prime heirs.
The brothers set up 3 separate family branches. The Eltzes of the Golden Lion, those of the Silver Lion, and those of the Buffalo Horns. Yet they jointly administered the estate, living in the castle together. Today's Castle Eltz still bears witness to the entangled property situation. Every family built itself a kind of terraced house within the fortified compound, each property shoulder to shoulder with its neighbor. Lack of space led to creative solutions. Just like in modern cities, the only way was up. Yet sometimes there was no love lost between the members of the family. One of them no longer wanted to take Mass along with his kin and had a chapel of his own built. However, the only space available was in the bedroom. Since custom and belief allowed no other rooms above a chapel, it was added in the form of an oriel. For practical reasons, the Eltzes, like all builders, resorted to materials from the nearby countryside.
Man fand dann in der Mitte eines Tals ein Felssporn.
When looking for a site, they found a rocky promontory in the middle of a valley, where there was basically all you needed to build a castle.
Die Grauwacke.
There was grey-wacke, wood of course, and there was slate nearby.
Ganz in der Nähe.
There was lime and clay too,
Lehm selbstverständlich.
so they were almost self-sufficient.
Man war fast autark in dem, was man hier tat.
To build a castle, you needed a good deal of expertise. So when planning his own house in 1300, Theodoric had hired a site manager. Yet push as he might, the project was stalled. Even in the Middle Ages, shortage of skilled workers was common. It's a widespread misconception that medieval castles were erected by drawing on serf labor. The local peasants simply didn't have the adequate know-how. French archaeologists have set out to research at first hand which skills were necessary to build a proper castle. Here in Gaillard, they rely only on the methods and tools of the Middle Ages. Since there are hardly any written sources on the actual working processes of medieval building sites, the archaeologists are trying things out for themselves. For instance, when it comes to handling the treadwheel crane, one of the most important and consequential innovations of the 13th century. To haul up a block of stone would now merely require 2 runners inside the wheel and a crane operator, whereas before, the combined force of a dozen men was needed. Work here in Gaillard began some 20 years ago. The castle is supposed to be finished in 2023. There are 50 permanent employees working all year round and another 200 seasonal helpers. According to estimates, it took a 75-strong medieval working unit just 5 years to raise a castle. One of the key artisans on a site like this one was the blacksmith. His job was to produce the tools for the other craftsmen, and he was never out of work. Attrition was immense. The stonemasons alone would use up 2 sets of picks, hammers, hoes, pickaxes, and countless chisels every single day. It's no different today. There has to be a constant flow of tools to keep the work going. So everything depended on the constant toil of a skilled blacksmith to guarantee the smooth running of the overall site. Clearly visible to the eye, there is a variety of marks carved into the stones. What was the purpose of these strange signs?
The traditional explanation is that these marks were a method of accounting. Each mason would mark the blocks he had finished and was paid according to the final tally. But these signs probably also serve to indicate the intended position of the blocks in the wall. So experimental research has shown that an interpretation of these marks as proud signatures like those of an artist can be dispensed with. Masons may have been the most artful of craftsmen, but they too were subject to the orders of the master builder, who told them what was needed and supervised their work. At Eltz, meanwhile, things were finally taking shape. Alas, not to everyone's liking. Theodoric's design put stress on familial harmony. If that were not enough, working conditions were anything but easy. And then, of course, there was the money. Building a castle was really expensive. Maybe not as much as building a cathedral, but costs definitely did run high. It would take a lesser noble 10 or 20 years until his castle was finished. In other words, practically all of his life. It's misleading to compare such a site to a modern seaside villa or other real estate projects. In the strictly hierarchical society of the Middle Ages, only about 8 to 10% of the elite were able to afford a castle of their own.
If you were better off, you could afford on average a workforce of about 90 men. At Castle Eltz, the brothers are still at loggerheads. Back then, there was no health insurance in case of accidents. The builder was under no obligation to compensate for a broken limb if someone fell from a scaffold or was buried under a crumbling wall. Anyway, work had to go on. The schedule was tight since building was restricted to the warm seasons. With the onset of winter, all work had to come to a halt. During the cold season, most of the time was spent inside the walls. So those who could afford it made sure that the interior provided as much comfort as possible. Few original furnishings from medieval castles have survived. But at Gaillard, we get at least an impression of how their rooms might have looked and how much care was applied to, for example, the floor. Walls would have been painted and elaborately decorated. There was hardly a blank wall in medieval castles. Colors were produced from a variety of pigments. Their range, however, wasn't yet as wide as today. Only natural ingredients were used for producing colors. Mineral clay or stones like hematite were pounded in great jars. Then the pigments were grated through a fine sieve. Finally, they were brewed up with water and binders like egg white, resin, or oil, and then painted on the walls in decorative patterns. At Castle Eltz, they adorned the walls with floral ornaments, an Oriental design brought home by Crusaders. The Middle Ages, too, had their trends and fashions. The same goes for the furniture. Yet the overall approach was definitely minimalistic.
Rooms weren't richly furnished. If we look up sources from the 15th century, there's a bed and a trunk, sometimes a walled-in cupboard. In the parlor, you'd see planks all around as seats, a table, 2 chairs, maybe 4. So a hall would be very sparsely furnished indeed. The saying, to rise from table, probably really means that you merely had a plank with a stand underneath, rather like IKEA today. If dinner was finished, you put it aside and had room for dancing.
Furniture in those days served a multitude of purposes. Trunks were the most common item. They were used as cases, as safes, or they were filled with sand for firefighting. And they also doubled as seats. Cupboards did not become standard before the end of the Middle Ages. By then, trunks would be overflowing with garments, which were now produced in abundance, creating the need for ever more storage space. About that time, the simple, sober style gave way to opulent decorations. Furniture became a status symbol. Their elaborate embellishment was meant to emphasize the social standing of their owners. Yet basically, medieval furniture was produced along the principles of today's designers. Form follows function. When they went to sleep, our ancestors preferred 4 posters like this replica at Castle Eltz. They were medieval reservoirs of heat. To get into bed, you first had to ascend 4 steps, utilizing the warm air that rises. Curtains could then be pulled to keep out the cold and store the warmth. When the autumn cold set in, there were other ways to keep warm. For instance, the bathroom could be used as a living room, since most of the time it would have been the only heated room in the castle. To cut costs, the fireplaces in the other rooms would only be fueled in winter. During autumn, you just put a tub of steaming hot water into the middle of the bathroom, and everyone would assemble around it. Once you had guests, however, there might be the occasional misunderstanding. Medieval bathhouses were notorious for their licentiousness, but there is a time and a place for everything. Conserving energy was an important aspect of life in medieval castles. Building expert Conrad Fischer explains how their inhabitants would cope with the problem.
Ab Weihnachten war es bitterkalt und auf diese eiskalten
From Christmas onwards, it was bitterly cold, so it took some skill to survive in the chilly rooms. Our knight, of course, would have known a few tricks. At first, he would have covered the walls with hides, probably from wild boars, or just some rags. Once the room was heated, they would heat up too.
Als nächste Stufe kamen dann die Holzverkleidungen.
The next step was wooden panels on the walls, which led to this impression of being in a log cabin. So the room would have been covered with thin wooden panels all around. The panels provided the same effect as the hides. Their surfaces would heat up, since wood is an excellent insulating material. With time, these panels went out of fashion and were replaced by something new, wall tapestries. With them, our knight was able to cover huge surfaces. And once he lighted a fire in a room, they in turn would heat up and make him feel warm and cozy.
Ruckzuck wird diese Oberfläche warm und er fühlt sich wohl und behaglich.
Wall tapestries were the comics of the Middle Ages. The stories they told were meant to be instructive as well as entertaining. Their protagonists ranged from Christian saints to pagan half-gods. During the long winter months, there wasn't much to do, and life in a castle could be downright boring. But medieval people were used to putting up with the rhythm of the seasons. They would improvise a concert playing the jaw harp or the fiddle, or indulge in games. Chess and backgammon were popular among the nobles and their ladies, whereas the servants preferred a round of checkers. They would play at skittles, as well as try their hand at ball games. Summer, however, was the season to go hunting, the classical pastime of a nobleman. The most prestigious variant was falconry. Emperor Frederick II even turned it into an art form. He personally wrote a best-selling book about it, which became the standard manual for falconers until well into the 19th century. But life in a castle wasn't just amusement. Their owners also had to address more serious matters. On average, a castle came under siege about every 75 years. Most of the time there was peace, at least on the surface. Underneath the surface, however, things could be gravely different. 2 generations after the 3 Eltz brothers, conflicts were rife at Castle Eltz. There may have been separate homes for their branches, yet there were just too many individual characters to get along without clashing.
In a
dynasty like the Eltzes, with their split heritage, there was of course permanent strife of one kind or another. So to keep these conflicts reasonably civilized, so-called letters of party truce were set up, which more or less regulated life as a whole. It was a kind of constitution which even laid down what followed if you had killed a man in hot blood.
Like in 1372, when John of the Buffalo Eltzes slew his brother Henry of the Golden Lion Branch. The motive was unclear, but his deed led to a party of truce letter in 1430, which stated, "They shall not do each other harm, neither bodily nor concerning their possessions, but protect and help each other as often as it's needed." And if necessary, they would meet in the Great Hall.
The Great Hall was the place where the male members of the family would convene to solve any conflicts. It was a kind of property owners' meeting. It was a fixed event with a view to solving problems there and then. The hall has two peculiarities. First, there are the fool's heads, which signify or even demand free speech. So all present are not only allowed to speak their minds, but actually compelled to do so without the others taking offense. Second, there's the rose of silence, which signifies that whatever is decided in here will not leave these walls.
Unlike the situation at Castle Eltz, the inhabitants of Burghausen in Bavaria had ample space. Burghausen is probably the longest castle ever built. On its promontory, it stretches over more than a kilometre. It once belonged to the Dukes of Bavaria Landshut, a branch of the Wittelsbach dynasty who ruled Bavaria for centuries. They chose Burghausen as one of their principal residences and turned it into one of the strongest fortifications in the country. The fortress is situated close to an important trade route, the Salzach River. The waterway carried goods from Austria and as far as Italy into all parts of the Holy Roman Empire. Every single ship is obliged to call here. In other words, Burghausen was a toll station. Its account books show that annual revenues were immense, and in folklore, the dukes quickly became the rich Wittelsbachs, not least because of a special commodity that was transported on the Salzach River.
The prime reason why this place was chosen to build the castle was the salt trade. Salt was extremely precious back then, and it was traded northwards on the Salzach. And here there was a crossing and an anchorage, which means that the dukes held the toll rights. And so, first the dukes, and then, with time, the Wittelsbachs too made a fortune here.
The main castle at the point of the promontory became the Wittelsbachs' treasury, and Burghausen was duly turned into one of the best protected castles in all of the empire. The revenues from the salt trade enabled the Wittelsbachs to live in splendor and to enlarge their castle into a veritable court and a seat of power. Up to 200 men, women and children lived here. The main building was reserved for the family and their immediate entourage. The upper bailey held the outbuildings, a bakery, a brewery, and stables for the horses. Their number was even greater than that of the inhabitants. They were kept at hand for transport, hunting, and in case of war. In the middle bailey, there was accommodation for the court officials, among them the parson. Then there was the arsenal, where the weapons were stored along with grain, beer, and other vital goods. Grooms, stable boys, cooks, maids, and other servants had to make do with the lowest bailey, along with the cattle. Daily life was strictly regulated. A court order set the seating plan at the 40 tables during dinner, closely observing the social order. The front tables were reserved for the most important members of the staff. Newcomers, such as wandering craftsmen, had to sit at the other end of the hall. Feeding so many mouths required a large amount of resources. That's why the Wittelsbachs, like many other castle builders, had decided on a conveniently located site amidst a net of trade routes. That way, a constant flow of goods was guaranteed. From Austria and Italy, there came luxury items such as salt and silk. Amber would find its way south from the Baltic Sea, and you could even order spices and frankincense from as far afield as the Orient. Basic needs, however, were provided by the surrounding land. Each castle was also the economic hub of its area. The peasants of its hinterland were obliged to pay the tithe and had to deliver a fixed amount of their harvests and of their livestock to the lord of the castle. Herbs and vegetables were grown in gardens. A medieval source depicts them as places where the apprentices of the apothecaries meet to pluck herbs and to dig for roots as ingredients for drugs. Hops and grapes were brewed and pressed. In the Middle Ages, people would rather turn to them than drink water, which was often contaminated and a carrier of disease. The variety of fruit and vegetables was considerably less than today. Tomatoes, sweet peppers, potatoes and pumpkins didn't reach Europe's tables until the end of the 15th century, after America had been discovered. So the diet was seasonal and regional. Vegetables were a staple feature of each meal, providing the necessary vitamins. Meat and fish were for most people scarce commodities. However, according to estimates, a nobleman devoured up to 80 kilograms of meat per year, while peasants had to make do with a quarter of that amount. Keeping victuals fresh was a major concern. The most common way to conserve food was to smoke it. Meat and sausages were hung in the fireplace, and when finished, under the ceiling, to keep rats and other vermin from helping themselves. Fruit and vegetables were safely kept in baskets. For conservation, people would also use salt, which was stored in small niches beside the hearth. That way, it stayed dry and did not get lumpy. Medieval castles even provided a kind of refrigerator for perishable victuals like eggs or milk products. With no electricity, the thick, cool walls kept provisions fresh. The basic food back then consisted of cereals, making up about 70% of the daily diet. They were made into bread, but also into porridge, and were an important base material for brewing beer, which in medieval households was mostly done by women. So when you sat down for a chat, there were always a few pints at hand. Which leads to another urgent question. Where did you relieve yourself? There was at least one toilet on every floor.
A small castle would have had 2 or 3 of these. There would have been one in the tower for the watchman to spare him the descent when he was bursting for a pee. There were a few exceptions. For instance, when the tower was in the inner court, which ruled out a garderobe. He had to make do with a bucket then. But generally, you'd find privies throughout. In the big imperial castles, there would have been as many as 20 or 30 of them.
Garderobes were built on the outer walls. A door separated them from the inner rooms. Yet in the Middle Ages, it would usually be left open while the lord of the castle went about his business and unashamedly went on conversing with whoever was present. Privacy back then was unknown. As for the guards on duty, there were special installations.
This is the seat, a block of stone with a hole in the middle, through which the feces plummeted straight down. And as we can see, this was a man's seat. This little bay carved out of the stone would prevent his penis from being squashed. Most considerate. Often there were small niches at the sides filled with moss or fern for cleaning, and a small hole for ventilation. A very nice example of a privy.
Ansonsten eine kleine Belüftungsöffnung. Es ist ein sehr schöner Abort hier.
The most innovative castle builders were active south of the Alps, like here at Castel del Monte in southern Italy. It was the brainchild of Emperor Frederick II and was built during the 13th century. It's an enigmatic site. Generations of historians have tried to explain the architectural details of its unusual design. Everywhere inside, there are mysterious grooves in the floor. What purpose did they serve? Two researchers believe to have deciphered their meaning. Architects Giuseppe Falaccara and Ubaldo Ochinegro have studied Castel del Monte closely for years. They're convinced that water was the central theme of the building. The castle seems to have been nothing less than a virtual spa.
At Castel del Monte, there are a number of sophisticated technical installations aimed at bringing in water from the surrounding area. They're quite similar to ancient features of this kind. Water was scooped from the ground, but there were also cisterns on top of 5 of the 8 towers to collect rainwater.
The cisterns were linked to an ingenious system of ducts which carried water into each room of the castle. Clever use of gravity even provided for sufficient pressure all around. It was a masterpiece of engineering. Another detail which long defied explanation are the decorative mouldings which are present throughout the upper floor of the castle.
Il dettaglio architettonico per eccellenza che ha catturato da subito la nostra attenzione.
The architectural feature which immediately caught our eye was the mouldings in the upper floor. They are actually cylindrical channels which were used to collect the humidity in the rooms.
Che rappresenta un espediente per la captazione.
The condensate from the walls would trickle down into these hollow spaces and was then conducted away. So the mouldings were practical and decorative at the same time.
When it comes to European castles, Castel del Monte stands out. The rest don't come close to this level of technical sophistication. Even some 100 years after the Italian wellness temple had been built, up north they were still grappling with the most basic problems. More often than not, the castle's inhabitants sat in the dark, even during daylight, since all openings would be sealed up with wooden shutters, parchment or straw, to keep out drafts and cold air. There were few castle owners who could afford window panes. In the 14th century, if budgets were tight, crown glass windows provided a way out. They were much simpler to produce than their larger counterparts. First, a glass blower formed a ball of 10 to 15 centimeters in diameter. Then, a specially trained master glazier molded the ball into a crown window. The small panes were then fixed into a lead frame. The overall window became a typical feature of late medieval castles, churches, as well as the houses of wealthy citizens. So thanks to glass windows, people in Central Europe no longer had to choose between light and warmth. Crown glass windows sealed up the openings while still letting in daylight.
In the 15th and 16th centuries, crown glass windows became industrialized, so a large number of people could afford them. These windows also had the advantage of reducing pressure by dispersing it over many small surfaces instead of one large pane. And given the lead frame, they also provided much more stability.
The spread of crown glass windows helped to raise comfort levels at late medieval castles considerably. The royal castle of Vincennes, east of Paris too, became ever more luxurious since its initial conception as a hunting lodge. Over time, the chateau became one of the prime residences of the royal family. It still boasts the highest medieval donjon ever built. It covered so much ground that it could house the entire household of the French court. The finest sculptors and masons were given the task of turning the castle's living rooms into similes of Gothic basilicas. Near the end of his life, Francis King Charles V ordered a magnificent chapel to be built at Vincennes. The immense windows are the highlight of the design. They depict the revelation of St. John. But the benefactors too had themselves immortalized in the images. Tournaments are of French origin. Today, they're an integral part of our conception of life at a castle. Yet tournaments rarely took place there. Most of them were held near cities, where there was more space and more amenities to house the many participants. Given the comparative smallness of a castle, staging large-scale events like a tournament was out of the question. Instead, there were feasts and banquets, and the hosts pulled out all the stops. There were pheasants, quails, quince, figs, dates, raisins, even cranes and swans. However, a contemporary noted, "Whatever the number of courses, there's no festive hospitality without good bread and wine." White bread was a rare delicacy back then. In the 15th century, the Dukes of Burghausen were famous for their fancy dress balls and carousals. They indulged in every conceivable luxury, as well as in some rather bizarre entertainment. The account books of Burghausen list a monthly salary for a court dwarf called Christoffel and a jester named Hamel. The drinking tally for the year 1477 is 1,185 buckets of beer and nearly twice as much of wine. Yet they also record that revenue fell far short of expenditure. Especially Duchess Hedwig, who lived at the castle from 1479 to 1502, was a truly big spender. Whereas her husband was rather tight-fisted and more than a little annoyed with his wife's carelessness. The Duchess preferred to cater for her daily needs by ordering many items from the city of Landshut, a 2-day march from the castle. The local products simply weren't up to her ladyship's high standards. So more and more often, the castle's coffers were empty. There was also a constant supply of drugs from the apothecaries in Landshut to cure headaches and hangovers. Candied fruit was the aspirin of the Middle Ages. But there was no cure for the galloping consumption afflicting the castle's finances. In addition, the House of Wittelsbach fell increasingly into debt through constant wars and was divided by inheritance disputes. In the end, they had to give up Burghausen, and their former residence sank into oblivion. It was a fate shared by many castles, yet somehow they live on.
Castles have always encouraged ideas, both kind of intellectual and sort of fantasy ideas. And even in the Middle Ages, the idea of a castle was almost as important as the fabric and the symbolism of castle, the association with chivalry and things that were kind of the mind rather of substance.
Castles have left their imprint on Europe far beyond the Middle Ages. Some of them have been rebuilt and are still used as homes. They are a testimony to medieval civilization and a visible link to our own past. Their ruins remind us of a colourful chapter of history. And even today, they cast a magnetic spell on us. In the 19th century, castles were once again all the rage, their legend taking hold throughout Central Europe, leading to new castles being built using medieval designs. By then, of course, castles were no longer constructed as a means of defense. They were nothing more than gigantic follies, sprung from a romantic glorification of the Middle Ages, like here in Neuschwanstein. But they're also proof of the unbroken fascination we continue to feel at the sight of these medieval bastions of power. Europe in the early Middle Ages. It was the beginning of a new era, a time when castles became status symbols. Bastions of power for rich nobles, like Count Otto of Hammerstein. Castles were the pride and joy of the elite, a fitting place of abode. A preacher, Berthold of Regensburg, wrote about them, "We have to kneel in front of you, to rise in front of you, and one has to fear you. You have a lot of space around you. You ride and you walk in splendor, and you have towering castles and fair ladies." The nobility was highly class conscious, and this was reflected in their homes, their clothing, and their food. But on this morning, Otto of Hammerstein and his wife had to settle for simple mush and some bread, and there was only water instead of wine. The reason for this meager meal: outside the walls of Otto's proud castle, troops, led by the emperor himself, had begun to lay siege to the fortress. Emperor Henry II was hell-bent on taking Castle Hammerstein at all costs. Yet, due to its position, Hammerstein was near invulnerable, and Henry lacked the means to storm it with a direct charge. Today, high above the Rhine, there are only ruins left of Castle Hammerstein, which is said to have been one of the first in the Middle Rhine Valley. Plants have long reconquered the walls, which were erected at the turn of the first millennium. Allegedly, Otto himself built the castle and duly named it Hammerstein. The possessions of his family spread out east of the Middle Rhine. Legacies and the dowry of his wife had increased his position in the country. A growing threat to the emperor, whose power was constantly challenged by self-confident lords throughout his realm. Otto, for instance, had a number of castles laid out over his fiefdom, like a net with which to strengthen his power. Or at least, so it seemed, since castles as such were merely static strongholds. a safe base for soldiers placed at strategic points like valleys, rivers and lakes to pacify and administer the country. During the 11th century, their garrisons were mostly wooden motte and bailey castles, which were cost-effective and quickly built. Secured by ramparts and fosses as barriers to keep off unwelcome intruders. Quite like today, whether in the form of a garden fence or a factory wall. If you wanted to play it safe, you built in stone. Provided your purse and the resources of the surrounding area allowed it. For any attacker, a castle of solid stone with a tower and high walls was definitely a challenge. If built in a prominent position, like Castle Hammerstein, it was practically impregnable. There were 3 ways to seize a castle: from beneath, by direct assault, or by siege. Hammerstein's underground of solid rock, however, made tunneling impossible. On the steep slopes, neither siege towers nor catapults could be put in place. Thus, the only option was to go for the castle gate. Yet there was only one way to get there, if you wanted to bring up a battering ram: the narrow access path beneath the wall. And from up there, the defenders could keep the attackers under continuous fire. Cutting off the castle supply was less of an effort and posed the biggest threat to the besieged. The effective elements of a castle's defense are still being used by architects today. In 2017, the BND, Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, moved into their new headquarters in the center of Berlin. It's a maximum security building designed by Jan Kleihus.
In a way, the center of the BND is comparable to a castle. Here we have a fence whose function is obvious and meant to be so. There is a ditch, and in certain parts the walls are extremely thick, just like in a castle. And finally, there is a windowless base. So, in principle, that is, metaphorically as well as architecturally, we have all the elements of a castle or fortress.
Then, as today, the entrance poses a particular challenge to architects. It must provide security, but also reflect the importance of the residence.
That too is an element we find in the architecture of medieval castles. The 2 gatehouses are meant to impress, like a portal bearing the owner's coat of arms. On the one hand, they serve as an entry for the employees, yet at the same time, they function as a prestigious ramp.
In the Middle Ages, the lords of a castle too considered the gate as a kind of showpiece. If, on the other hand, representation wasn't that paramount, the gate, as the obvious weak point in the castle's defences, would be given special protection. You'd have crenels and loopholes, through which attackers could be fought with arrows and stones. Next, a portcullis would back up a solid wooden gate. Since the end of the High Middle Ages, drawbridges were set up to deny access to the gates, and there was no drawbridge without a ditch. A ditch or fosse was the simplest means to keep the castle's attackers at bay. Whether it was dug out or carved into the rock, siege engines could then only be brought close to the walls after the ditch had been painstakingly refilled. A water-filled ditch or moat also contributed towards sustaining the castle's inhabitants. In it, fish like carp or crustaceans like crab were kept, which would be served at the table of the lord of the castle. In 1402, in his book Bella Fortis, military technician Conrad Kaiser noted that ditches were even used to keep livestock. Especially popular were geese and chickens, but also dogs as a kind of living alarm system. During a siege, however, they quickly lost their usefulness. For 3 months, Otto had managed to withstand the siege. But winter in a castle was harsh. Even the furniture had already been burned. There was no option left but to surrender. According to custom, Otto and Ermengarde now had to humiliate themselves in front of the victorious emperor, dressed as penitents. Barefoot and in simple garments, they walked up to Henry. First, they had to plead guilty to having brought about the conflict. Then, they had to implore forgiveness. Henry II didn't grant mercy as easily as his predecessors. To him, clemency was only one option. In the case of unyielding resistance, he did not hesitate to impose the death penalty on an aristocratic opponent. However, Otto and Ermengarde were spared the scaffold, but they did not escape unscathed. Otto's possessions were confiscated. Hammerstein became the emperor's property, and thus a Reichsburg, an imperial castle.
At the top of the medieval hierarchy, there was the ruler, who had to administer and pacify a huge realm. And to accomplish this, he would build castles at certain points, which he then garrisoned with nobles or knights who owed him allegiance.
Building their own castles, the travelling emperors early on created a net of seats within the Holy Roman Empire. The imperial castles served as strongholds, as well as royal residences, and they were ideally suited to remind the local rulers of the presence of the monarch, a concept unique to Europe. In early medieval France, there was no administrative structure like that of the travelling emperors. Therefore, the architects of its castles aimed less at representation and more at well-fortified designs. Up to the end of the Middle Ages, French donjons fulfilled a double function. They were both residential and defensive buildings. To defend the castle, its garrison would fire arbalests and bows through the crenels. Protruding openings up on the tower, so-called machicolations, provided the possibility of fighting attackers even at the foot of the building. It was a successful design, imported to Britain by William the Conqueror in the wake of his invasion in 1066. The Bayeux Tapestry is a contemporary record of his successful campaign, up to the Battle of Hastings. It also shows the pillars of his policy of conquest, the castles by which he secured the country. In the end, he had seized or newly built nearly 100 of them. Thus, the features of the castles of northern France became the core of British castle architecture. But across the Channel, with time, a rectangular floor plan prevailed, the so-called Great Tower or Keep. One of them is still a landmark of London. The White Tower, commissioned by William the Conqueror.
The reason for building a building like the White Tower is you can combine three things in one building. One is a residence. It is undoubtedly defensive. I mean, you could defend the White Tower against an army for a long time. And thirdly, and most importantly, it looks great. A tower is always something that dominates the landscape. It always catches the eye. It always sends a message to you about the power of the person who owns it. Copying the White Tower was a kind of industry in the 12th century. And the details of its construction were referred to by all the designers of great towers thereafter.
However, on the continent, elaborate construction programs like those of the Norman conquerors were rare. A chronicler, Bruno of Merseburg, mentioned that Emperor Henry IV had 8 castles built near Goslar to protect the silver mines in the Harz Mountains. Yet, as the chronicler notes, the garrisons at once set about subduing, oppressing, and exploiting the nearby lands. So it wasn't just emperors and kings who benefited from the new seats of power. The administrators, appointed by the rulers, became ever more important as their property and influence steadily increased. In the High Middle Ages, the so-called ministerials formed a band of nobles in their own right. Famous dynasties like the von Pappenheims sprang from ordinary administrators of a castle. almost 100 years had passed since Otto had defied the emperor. Now Castle Hammerstein too had become the seat of a ministerial by the name of Ludwig, who was to bear witness to the decline of this once proud fortress. Castles weren't merely strongholds for soldiers and their rulers. They were also gigantic vaults for the treasures of the sovereigns. Since 1105, Hammerstein was keeper of the most precious treasure in the whole of the Holy Roman Empire, the Imperial regalia. Possession of these insignia was paramount for any king intending to make a bid for imperial rule. Replicas of the scepter, the sword, the imperial crown and the holy lance bear witness to the former treasury's splendor. If an emperor was crowned without the imperial regalia, the legitimacy of his rule would be doubted from the very beginning. Thus, to protect them from unauthorized access, they were kept in the empire's safest castles. But by then, Hammerstein was no longer a prime choice. As new castles challenged its position, Ludwig helplessly had to look on as Hammerstein's greatest treasure was removed at the behest of the emperor. From now on, the castle was merely a backwater of imperial politics. For more than 2 centuries, there was a saying, "He who has trifles has the empire." In 1125, the imperial regalia found a new treasury in the Palatinate, and Castle Trifles became the most important site in the Holy Roman Empire. Trifles, however, wasn't just a safe depository for gold, silver and precious stones. In spring 1193, the most valuable prisoner of his time was brought here. The King of England, Richard the Lionheart. He had become a hostage of Emperor Henry VI. Richard had made a lot of enemies in Europe during the Third Crusade. Now he had to make his journey home overland, disguised as a pilgrim. But near Vienna, in December 1192, his cover was blown. Richard wasn't called the Lionheart for nothing. He was as proud as he was short-tempered. Yet fate would turn him into a pawn in one of the largest extortion schemes ever. The King of England was arrested. A prisoner of his class would of course be treated accordingly. After all, the emperor expected a king's ransom for him, as was common when holding an aristocratic hostage. So Richard wasn't thrown into a sinister dungeon, but, as it was said, kept in honorable confinement. Anyway, today's researchers are positive that only a few castles actually had gloomy jails. So not every sinister-looking room in a castle was used as a dungeon. Floor plans often led to the assumption that the dark, uncomfortable, and obviously unusable basements of a tower were used as dungeons.
Of course, there are parts in every castle where, with a bit of imagination, that might have been possible. The usual basement of a keep was between 6 and 8 meters deep and was only accessible from above. So, in theory, such a room might have been used as a dungeon. But how did you get in there? There was just a hole from above. So, I don't think that this would be used as a dungeon. There were exceptions, of course, but that wouldn't have been the rule.
For the emperor's aristocratic prisoners, the conditions of their confinement could differ significantly, though. In 1113, Margrave Witprecht of Groich, for instance, was kept here in chivalrous imprisonment, much like the King of England. His co-prisoner, Archbishop Adalbert of Mainz, however, didn't fare as well. On his release, he was said to have been close to death, reduced to a skeleton, and with a long grey beard. In 1194, a group of Sicilian noblemen who had been involved in a conspiracy against the emperor and were imprisoned in trefoils suffered even more badly. After another assassination attempt 3 years later, Henry VI had the prisoners blinded as a measure of reprisal. Richard, however, would be spared such cruelties. During his imprisonment, he even enjoyed all kinds of benefits. Allegedly, he even held drinking feasts and wrestling matches with his guards. And although in custody, he was allowed to conduct his state affairs from Castle Trifels. Legend has it that he was found and liberated by a wandering English troubadour. Yet the truth is more prosaic. The emperor's demands for Richard's release were huge. He wanted military support for the conquest of Sicily, and above all, ransom money Richard would be hard-pressed to raise. But was there any other choice? Finally, he accepted the terms. 35,000 kilograms of silver, about triple the annual income of the English crown. A king's ransom so large, it caused a severe economic crisis in England. But in 1194, Richard regained his freedom. During his crusade to the Holy Land, and while imprisoned within the Holy Roman Empire, Richard had gleaned considerable knowledge of castles and their designs. And 2 years after his release, he put that knowledge to good use. He gave orders to build the imposing Chateau Gaillard in Normandy, intending to lead the continental art of fortification into a new era. After just 1 year of construction time, Richard could look with pride on his brainchild, and is alleged to have said, "Behold, how fair is this year-old daughter of mine."
On a beaucoup dit que Château Gaillard
Chateau Gaillard was long considered to be the first castle incorporating the revolutionary step from 12th century passive fortification to active defense. Today we view this a little differently, because Chateau Gaillard has neither predecessors nor successors.
It's very difficult to identify any particular piece of the apparatus of military architecture which you can say, right, that occurs first in the Levant and then second in Europe, and it must have been copied. The Crusaders of various periods came back with an impression of not Islamic fortifications, but Byzantine fortifications.
But just 8 years later, Richard's attempt to establish a new architectural design for an impregnable castle failed. In 1204, the French King Philip II attacked Chateau Gaillard with 6,000 men. They overcame the first wall using a siege tower. Then, crawling through a lowly positioned latrine, they reached the second courtyard. From there, they dug a tunnel and poured into the central court, where the final battle took place. During the previous centuries, there had been major advances in the techniques of siege warfare, and their impact on Chateau Gaillard was immediate. If a castle was skillfully placed, however, it was rarely possible to use siege engines, and any direct charge would result in heavy losses. Miners were much more effective. They were able to dig protective ditches right up to the castle. Once there, the sappers with their pickaxes, hammers and chisels could peck holes into the base of the wall and provide the attackers with a means of access. A tunnel filled with combustible material below the wall was even more effective. Fire would consume the wooden beams, causing the wall to collapse. More daring, a charge using scaling ladders or even human pyramids. There are reports of such attacks up to the late Middle Ages. An even more cunning tactic, which was often used, was to bribe an inhabitant or smuggle in a traitor. In the year 1331, at Castle Eltz on the Moselle River, another significant factor became apparent when it came to castle battles: psychology. Bishop Balduin of Trier wanted to seize the castle to put the knights of Ehrenberg, Schöneck, Waldeck and von Eltz in their place. The Eltzer feud, as it was called, had been smouldering for months. The bishop had sent a small army to lay siege to the castle, with a view to cutting off supplies and thus force its garrison to give up. Yet the longer the siege lasted, the more difficult it became to keep up morale among Balduin's troops, because somehow or other the castle's inhabitants managed to hold on. Time and again, the Eltzers succeeded in smuggling provisions into the castle. The siege had turned into an endless game of cat and mouse, and with persistent failure, the ranks of the besieging army began to thin out alarmingly. There was only one way to avoid this: improve your own troops' living conditions in the field. For instance, by taking them out of the cold, damp tents into solid accommodation. And so, not far from Eltz, the besiegers built a castle of their own. Today there are only a few ruins left of this counter-castle, or Trutzburg, just a few hundred meters away from Castle Eltz itself. On this square-shaped ground, there once stood a tower house shielded by a wall against Castle Eltz. Its position is crucial. Despite the proximity to their fortress, the Eltzers were unable to prevent its construction. A building like this must have put huge psychological pressure on the besieged. The counter-castle was used again and again as a stratagem. In the Hessian town of Runkel, its eponymous castle still dominates the site. Opposite Runkel, Castle Schadeck was finished in 1288. Castles like this were an excellent method of demonstrating to your opponents, we are here to stay. There were many factors that determined the duration of the siege. The attacker's tenacity and the perseverance of the besieged were among the most significant. Castle Rheinfels above Saint-Gouard and Chateau Montségur in the Pyrenees each put up resistance for nearly 1 year. Castle Turand on the Moselle River, as well as Chateau Gaillard in Normandy, even withstood for 2 years. They were the prime examples of what could be achieved in the defense of a well-fortified site, like that of Castle Eltz too. Yet only if a castle was well prepared would it hold out that long. But this called for the defenders to stockpile sufficient supplies of food, which could be stored for a long time.
The best way to capture a castle is to starve it out, because no castle is impregnable. You often hear the impregnable castle of this, that, and the other. There's no such thing. You can have a castle which is pretty much impregnable against physical attack, but no castle can hold out forever because the people within it have to eat and they have to drink. And if those things run out, you're finished.
So even a lot of provisions weren't much use if the water supply were to dry up, and a single person is estimated to consume about 5 litres per day. A spring inside the castle grounds was rare, and any water supply lines from the outside could easily be cut. Castles on hills were particularly dependent on collecting rainwater or digging a well.
Die Wasserversorgung in der Burg, in der Höhenburg.
The basic means of water supply in a hill castle was the cistern. In the lowlands of northern Germany, that would of course have been different. So, if you find deep wells, they're usually features of imperial castles, like Triffers, Kyffhäuser and Graustein, at the turn of the 12th to the 13th century, which are the most prominent examples. Yet, even there, you would look for a site a bit further away to avoid having to dig really deep.
At Castle Treefels, the well shaft had to be driven nearly 80 meters into hard rock. It was back-breaking work for the miners. In extreme cases, shafts would reach as deep as 176 meters. Then the construction of a well could last up to 40 years and cost as much as the overall site. At Castle Eltz, they had to make do with a specially built cistern which caught the rainwater. Yet its inhabitants managed to survive the siege reasonably well. The counter-castle close by did little to impress the besieged. So, the attackers brought in the heavy artillery. A gigantic catapult was put into place. And then, but the machine wasn't intended to destroy the castle. It was only meant to spread terror among the inhabitants, who now could no longer step outside their doors without risking their lives. In 1333, Castle Eltz was bombarded with a trebuchet like this. Contemporaries called it an instrumentum diabolicum, a device of the devil. In the Bavarian town of Wunsiedel, they've built a replica. And since it's fully workable, we can put the medieval super slingshot to the test on a firing range of 130 meters. The 16-meter high contraption is operated by Michael Fuchs and the members of Wunsiedel's Historical Society. Its construction relies on medieval representations, and it's been adapted to modern standards only insofar as safety requirements are concerned. Experimental archaeology like this is an established means towards checking the authenticity of ancient texts. According to medieval sources, trebuchets were used to shoot at targets over a distance of between 300 and 500 meters. Tests have shown that at full capacity, trebuchets are able to hurl stone balls of 75 kilograms over a distance of 1 kilometer onto a target of just 5 square meters. The impact of the projectiles reveals the efficiency of the catapult.
Of course, it's fascinating to see the impact of such a device. It's easy to imagine what would have happened to a castle under such fire. The projectiles wouldn't have smashed the walls, but you could have demolished the battlements and aimed at the weak points of a castle, which was actually a sitting duck.
Yet stones weren't the only items in the gunner's arsenal. There were other, more devastating devices. One of those who published his observations on the application of the devilish devices was an Italian engineer from Siena named Taccola. He has passed down numerous drawings of real as well as of imaginary war machines. He even recommended the use of firebombs or blazing live animals, which would run around the castle setting everything on fire. If this weren't enough, feces, carrion and dead bodies were used as biological weapons, intended to spread plagues and to lower the morale of the besieged. In the highly religious Middle Ages, the besieged often prayed for divine intervention. Those who lacked confidence in the ways of the Lord opted for an earthier exit strategy.
The existence of escape tunnels is yet another myth. It's said that there were subterranean corridors from one castle to another of up to 1 kilometer in length, or that some even passed under rivers. However, to dig tunnels like that calls for highly advanced mining techniques. The closest we get to that are the so-called earth stables, which can be found especially in Bavaria. It's true they were dug in the Middle Ages and often served as shelters, but we know of only very few proper escape tunnels.
Understandably so, since they harboured a definite risk and had to be constantly guarded. If a tunnel could lead you out of the castle, it might just as quickly lead you in. The owners of Castle Eltz rejected this emergency design. In 1333, after a massive bombardment by the Trebuchets, the Knights of Eltz surrendered. They had to accept Balduin as their feudal lord, who rubbed even more salt into their wounds, letting them keep their castle, but bestowing on them the counter-castle as a fiefdom, which they had to maintain at their own expense. But 150 years later, a new era had begun. In the late Middle Ages, gunpowder weapons provided hitherto unknown opportunities to fight back. Quite like the salesmen of today going from door to door, back then cannon dealers were travelling from town to town and from castle to castle. Like all salesmen through the ages, they were quite often looked upon as a nuisance. On the other hand, the interest in military gadgets or superweapons was as widespread among medieval knights as it is among the power-hungry dictators of our time. Of course, they didn't travel with real guns, but with scaled-down models, included in the price when buying the original. Some of these miniature cannons can still be found at Castle Eltz. Its owners developed a veritable passion for collecting these models, since they were also used as children's toys.
A cannonball from these models, we've tried it, will smash through some 15 centimeters of solid oak or rip off 3 heads in a row. That's just an estimate, of course, so you had to make sure that your kids didn't fool around with them.
Yet there was still a long way to go until guns of that force became common. The first cannons impressed more because of their black powder explosions than their actual penetrative power. In Central Europe, it was the future Emperor Maximilian I who at the end of the 15th century ordered the production process of cannons to be perfected. His Book of Armaments features illustrations of his numerous guns, from the small field gun to the powerful bombard able to crack a castle. Emperor Maximilian went down in history not only as the first knight, but also as the first gunner of the empire. New weapons called for new means of protection. Up till then, fortifications had been designed merely to withstand an attack by foot soldiers, battering rams, and missiles, or to demonstrate the owner's social status. The keep, for instance, which from the 12th century onward became a characteristic element of castles in Central Europe, didn't serve any military purpose, but rather as a widely visible symbol of power. During the 13th century, the shield wall was another element intended to impress. Yet, as it was particularly high and massive, it doubled as a protective wall to shield the rest of the castle against bombardment by heavy catapults. At the same time, gatehouses, auxiliary towers protruding from the curtain, portcullises and drawbridges were introduced. From the 14th century onwards, the outer ward became popular as an additional rampart to fight charging foot soldiers. The advent of firearms, however, forced the architects to explore new methods when it came to building castles. Yet, not everybody was prepared to upgrade the defense of his castle and to invest in new technology. In the late Middle Ages, numerous nobles simply sold their ownership rights of their castles. Some, however, believed that the medieval fortress still had a future. Like Franz von Sickingen, who in 1518 made a bid for Castle Narnstein in the Palatinate. He was thoroughly acquainted with the latest military developments and their efficiency. True to his motto, to dare and to act, he intended to prepare Castle Narnstein for a new era. Von Sickingen, the archetype of a robber knight, deemed the castle's position as perfect for a retreat from his raids. High above Landstuhl, Narnstein rises on a huge red rock which gave it its name. For more than 3 centuries, it had dominated the area, but it was not prepared for artillery fire. All over Europe, architects developed new components to protect castles against ever more powerful weapons. In Lower Austria, at Castle Agstein, the owners used an array of massive blocking walls to make any attacker's access to the inner castle more difficult. Like at Castle Wildenstein, a kind of oversized shield wall, a so-called bastion, was set up to protect the main castle. From up here, even the outer area of the castle could be defended with gunfire across the outer bailey. Between 1470 and 1540, however, all across Europe, a new form of castle architecture was established. At Fortress Coburg in Franconia, these alterations can still be retraced. To protect the walls against cannon fire, they had to be strengthened. The solution was a widening of the ramparts by further brickwork and heaped up earth behind the walls. The newly built platform, in turn, provided sufficient space for artillery. In 1527, even the famous Albrecht Dürer devoted himself to the new defensive architecture and published a paper titled Some Instructions on the Fortification of Towns, Castles and Hamlets. He specifically mentioned turrets as a new means of fortification. They would provide excellent protection against iron cannonballs, which in contrast to the outdated stone projectiles, in Dürer's words, would knock harder. Castle Munau across the Swiss border near Schaffhausen was set up as late as 1589 and relied entirely on turrets as recommended in Dürer's work. Just a few kilometers further east, Castle Hohenpfeil was made into a fortress in 1521. In all, the owners spent more than 50,000 guilders on its construction, the equivalent of 15 million euros. Yet the investment paid off. Hohenpfeil withstood 5 sieges. In 1496, King Ferdinand of Aragon had a unique fortress built at Saus-le-Chateau in southern France. It combined the tried and tested fortress architecture of the Middle Ages with new elements of fortification.
Gunpowder and castles is an interesting love-hate relationship. It's a very long time before castles start changing in their form in order to resist artillery. In fact, it's kind of it's the other way around. The first sign of artillery architecturally is to use artillery in castles.
As can be seen at Castle Narnstein. Between 1519 and 1523, Franz von Sickingen had turned it into an artillery castle. Its centerpiece was now the huge battery tower in the east. It shielded most parts of the castle from attack and simultaneously served as an emplacement for numerous cannons. Since Sickingen was well aware of the destructive potential of large caliber guns, he never set out on a campaign without his giant cannon, the Nightingale. He even had a verse emblazoned on it. Nightingale I'm called, sweet and lovely is my song. To whom I sing, the days are long. A cynical warning to the besieged. However, the mere presence of such a monstrous weapon could open the gates of castles and of towns. Handling a mega gun like the Nightingale could pose problems, though, especially in bad weather. Due to its sheer weight, the monster often got stuck underway and had to be pushed inch by inch. Yet for von Sickingen, the efforts paid off, earning his upkeep by waging war on other nobles and their castles, as well as on entire towns, and becoming one of the most dreaded robber knights of his time. He insisted on the time-honored right of a knight to wage feuds, in other words, to settle disputes by force of arms. Like today's collection agencies, feud entrepreneurs like Sickingen would also enforce recourse claims, be they justified or not. It was the last attempt by the knights to save their kind from oblivion. For centuries, they had been the elite forces on the battlefields of Europe, earning glory and considerable wealth. Now, foot soldiers and firearms had supplanted them, ending their main source of income. Their castles, too, dwindled in importance. The hubs of the New World were the cities, where power and influence, trade and innovation came together. The old symbols of power were nothing more than reminders of a proud past. In the ancient center of Nuremberg, you can still find the Nassauer House. It was erected by citizens who wanted to impress their neighbors with elements of a stately castle. In Regensburg, 100 kilometers further southeast, from the 13th century onwards, patrician families built keep-like towers. They are a common sight south of the Alps, but rare in the north. Like the keeps, they represented the power and wealth of the families living there. However, cities could only maintain their wealth and influence if properly protected. City walls, like here in Lübeck, functioned like the curtain walls of a castle, albeit on a somewhat larger scale. If a city was rich, it was of course a lot easier to upgrade its defenses, as is shown by the city model of Ingolstadt, made by Jakob Sandner. In the 16th century, no fewer than 8 bastions were added to the medieval city wall. For Franz von Sickingen, his latest campaign against a well-fortified city ended in disaster. In 1522, Trier withstood his guns for 5 days without having to mourn a single dead. Von Sickingen had to withdraw and was hunted by a coalition of princes who pursued him as far as Castle Narnstein. They assembled the largest military force the region had ever seen. The castle did not withstand the barrage from their numerous guns for long. After 2 days, it was ripe for attack. Franz von Sickingen had been heavily wounded by falling debris from the castle walls. A few days later, he died of his injuries. Narnstein fell into ruins and never again served as a defensive stronghold. To historians, events like this heralded the end of the great days of the castles. Most of them couldn't keep up with the ever-advancing technology. Yet firearms were only the tool, not the trigger of their demise.
But castles themselves, while they were castles in the full sense of an aristocratic residence, a fortress and a symbol of authority and so on, don't really come to an end, as it were, because of artillery. It's the institutional changes, the political and social changes in the country that bring about the demise of the castle in its medieval form. It isn't really artillery. That's a separate issue.
Just 1 year after the fall of Castle Narnstein, the writing was on the wall. The era of the castle had come to an end. In the southwest of the empire, the peasants revolted. It was a desperate attempt by the lowest social classes to free themselves from oppression by their secular and clerical overlords. One of their targets were the castles. In many places, their inhabitants simply fled. So only a few had to be besieged, yet soon they would also fall. Between 1524 and 1526, about 1,000 of them were torn down by the peasants. In the following decades and centuries, castles became less and less important. At the beginning of the 14th century, more than 100,000 of them had spread throughout Europe. But from then on, their numbers steadily declined. Today, nearly 40% of them are in ruins, and only 10% have survived. Yet, even if the age of the castles had come to an end, there was still a desire for a safe place. It was about this time that in a feud-stricken Italy, architects came up with a design that would shape Europe for the next 400 years.
It was a time of transition for defensive military architecture. Engineers had to find solutions to provide the perfect means of protection regarding the new situation. This meant that fortifications were needed that could stand up to the new armory, since Italy during the 16th century was in a constant state of war.
The bulwarks became huge bastions, projecting from the curtain walls like arrowheads. From them, every nook and cranny in front of the fortress wall could now be covered by firearms. At first, these innovations only served to protect residential castles. But these places would soon lose their residential character. In Jülich, for example, the design of an Italian architect turned a so-called bastioned palace into a citadel used for purely military purposes. Fortresses like these are military successors of the medieval castles. Up to the 20th century, they would continue to shape the armed conflicts of Europe. And the castles? For centuries, they merely served as landmarks or quarries. Then, at the end of the 18th century, perspectives changed. The emerging age of Romanticism rediscovered the ruins. Legends were woven around them. Poets extolled their decayed splendor. Even new castles were built, reflecting a glorified view of the past. Castles became sites of historical remembrance. No other type of building symbolizes an entire era in the way the castle represents the European Middle Ages. And to this very day, many of them doze like a sleeping beauty, deep within the forests, covered by greenery. For others, which down the centuries were altered by repeated rebuilding, there are plans to restore them to their original condition. But doesn't this mean negating the eventful history of these impressive buildings? Hasn't every era the right to leave its traces on these bastions of power?